The morning of my wedding, I stood at the back of the church alone. No hand on my arm, no voice in my ear telling me to breathe. Just the low hum of the organ, the scent of gardenias I'd picked out 6 months earlier, and 73 guests turning in their pews to look at the doors that hadn't opened yet, waiting for the family that wasn't coming. I had checked my phone 11 times in the car. Nothing from my mother, nothing from my brother. One text from my father, sent at 6:47 that morning, that said only, "We won't be there. You made your choice." I didn't cry. I had already done that the night before, sitting on the bathroom floor of the hotel room while my maid of honor, my college roommate Claire, held my hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say. I had used up every tear I had. So when the doors opened and I walked down that aisle by myself, past the lilies and the candles and the faces of people who loved me and people who barely knew me, I kept my chin up. I kept my shoulders back. I had spent 8 years as a firefighter. I knew how to walk into something that scared me. Marcus was waiting at the altar. When he saw me, just me, his eyes went soft in a way that made my chest hurt. He didn't look at the empty doorway behind me. He just looked at me. Later he told me that was the moment he knew he had made the right choice. I told him I already knew that. I had known it for 3 years. We got married on a Saturday in October in Raleigh, North Carolina, surrounded by his family and our friends, and the 4 empty seats in the front left pew stayed empty the whole ceremony. My mother's name was on the program as a reader. She had said yes when I asked her, 4 months earlier, standing in her kitchen while she made coffee and barely looked at me. She had said yes, and then she had not come. I won't tell you it didn't matter. It mattered more than I have words for. But I will tell you that when Marcus slid the ring onto my finger and the pastor said the words and everyone around us applauded, I felt something settle in my chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. Quiet. Solid. Done. We had our reception at a venue outside the city, strung with lights, and we danced until midnight. And my new mother-in-law pulled me into a hug so tight I could feel her heartbeat, and she whispered, "Welcome to the family, baby girl." I held on to that for a long time. I need to tell you how we got here, because it doesn't make sense without the beginning. I grew up in Greensboro. My father was an engineer, precise and controlled, a man who ran our household like a project with deliverables and deadlines. My mother went along with him the way water goes along with the shape of whatever container it's in. My brother Derek was 3 years younger than me, and had been, from the moment he was born, the center of everything my father cared about. Derek would carry on the family name. Derek would do great things. Derek's science fair projects were framed. Mine were thrown away. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's true. And because you need to understand the architecture of the family I grew up inside, so you understand why. When I told my father at 22 that I wanted to be a firefighter, he looked at me the way you look at someone who has said something so absurd that you don't even know where to begin correcting them. "That's not a career," he said. "That's a phase." It was not a phase. I had known since I was 16, when a fire broke out in the apartment building 2 streets over, and I stood on the sidewalk and watched the crew work, calm and organized in the middle of chaos, and felt something in me lean toward it like a plant toward light. I enrolled in the fire academy at 22. I graduated at 23. I was hired by a station in Raleigh, and I moved there, and I built a life. My father did not speak to me for 8 months after I took the job. When he finally called, it was not to apologize. It was to tell me that I was wasting my potential, and that when I came to my senses, they would be waiting. I said thank you and got off the phone and went back to my shift. This was the pattern. My choices, the career, the city, the apartment. Eventually Marcus were treated as personal affronts. Every time I did something that wasn't in my father's plan for me, there was a silence, then a call, then a version of the same speech about wasted potential and disappointing the family. My mother never called on her own. She only ever talked to me when my father was in the room. My brother Derek called occasionally, usually when he wanted something, and always managed to work in some comment about how hard things were for our parents because of me. Marcus came into my life when I was 27. He was a high school history teacher, patient and funny and completely unbothered by the fact that I worked 24-hour shifts and came home smelling like smoke. He met my family once, at Thanksgiving, and sat at the table while my father talked past him for 3 hours, and my mother refilled everyone's water glass every 15 minutes to have something to do with her hands. On the drive home, Marcus said, "I love you," and I never want to do that again. I laughed for the first time all day. We got engaged 2 years later. I called my mother first, because I thought it might land softer that way. She said, "Oh." Then she said she'd have to talk to your father. That night my father called and said that if I was serious about this, I needed to understand that Marcus would never be fully welcomed by the family. I asked him why. He said, "You know why." I said I didn't, because I wanted him to say it plainly. He wouldn't. He just repeated that Marcus would never fully belong. I hung up. I cried. And then I planned my wedding anyway. I invited them. All of them. I sent formal invitations and followed up by phone and answered every question my mother asked about the venue and the menu and the flowers and what color she should wear. I thought, in the way that you think things you know probably aren't true but can't stop hoping for, that they would come. That when the day arrived, they would choose me. They didn't. 6 weeks after the wedding, I was in the kitchen making dinner when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. First contact since the morning of my wedding, since that one cold line. I stood at the counter and read it. "Derek's getting married in the spring. We're looking at venues. The deposit on the one we want is $9,200. We'd like you to contribute. You can send it to your mother's account." I read it 3 times. I set my phone down on the counter. I stirred the pasta. I waited to feel something rage. Maybe. Or that old familiar grief, but what I felt instead was something much stranger. Something almost like clarity, like a fog I'd been standing in my whole life had lifted, and I could see the field around me for the first time. My father had not come to my wedding. My mother had not come. My brother had not called to congratulate me, had not sent so much as a card. And now, 6 weeks later, as though nothing had happened, as though there was no debt of basic decency that anyone felt they owed me, my father was texting me to ask for $9,200. I picked my phone back up. I opened the conversation. I typed, "I wish Derek all the happiness in the world." Then I opened my Venmo, and I sent my father $1. The note said, "Best wishes for the wedding." Then I put my phone in the drawer under the coffee maker, and I went back to making dinner. Marcus found out when my father called his cell phone 40 minutes later. He walked into the kitchen looking the way he looks when he's trying not to laugh during a serious moment, this particular tension around his mouth, and he said, "Your father is very upset about $1. I told him what I'd done. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I'm going to need you to frame that Venmo receipt." I said I already had. That night the calls came in waves. My father. My mother. Derek. My father again. I let them go to voicemail. In the morning I listened to them back to back, sitting in my car in the station parking lot before my shift. My father's voice was the voice he used when he wanted to sound controlled but wasn't. He used the word disrespectful 4 times. He said I had humiliated the family. He said that I owed it to my brother to show up the way family is supposed to show up. He said, and this is the part I've thought about many times since, after everything we've done for you. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went inside and did my job. I didn't respond to any of the calls. I talked to Marcus that night, and we agreed together that I would not be contributing to my brother's wedding, would not be attending my brother's wedding, and that we would give the situation space and see what came next. What came next, over the following 3 weeks, was increasingly aggressive texts from my brother, 2 more voicemails from my father, and a handwritten letter from my mother that said she was heartbroken and she didn't understand why I was choosing to destroy the family, and that she hoped I would pray on it. I read the letter twice. I put it in a box in the closet where I keep things I'm not ready to throw away but can't look at every day. Then one afternoon I came home from a 48-hour shift exhausted in the deep, cellular way that kind of work exhausts you, and there were 2 police cars parked outside my building. I stopped on the sidewalk. I still had my bag on my shoulder. The officers were talking to my building manager by the front entrance, and when they saw me walking up, one of them separated from the group and came toward me. He said my name. I said, "Yes, that's me." He said they had received a report of theft, and that my father had filed a complaint alleging that I had taken property from the family home. I stood very still. I thought about the last time I had been in my parents' house, which was Christmas 2 years ago, when I had brought a pie and sat through 4 hours of dinner and come home with the Tupperware. I'd brought the pie in and nothing else. I said, "What property?" The officer looked slightly uncomfortable. He said the complaint listed jewelry and documents. I said, I haven't been inside my parents' home in almost 2 years. I'd be happy to show you my work schedule, my building's entry logs, and I can tell you right now that if you'd like to look through my apartment, you're welcome to, but you'll need a warrant. He looked at me for a moment. I'm used to being looked at that way. People do it when they're recalibrating something. He said they'd look into it. He said I might want to speak with a lawyer. I said, I am absolutely going to do that. I went upstairs. I sat on the couch in my work clothes with my bag still on my shoulder. I called Marcus, who was at school. He picked up on the second ring and I told him what had happened. And there was a silence on his end that I had learned to recognize as the silence of a patient man reaching the edge of his patience. He said, I'll be home in an hour. I said, okay. Then I called a lawyer. The lawyer, a woman I found through a colleague at the station who spoke very quickly and took no nonsense whatsoever, sent a letter to my parents within the week. It outlined, in careful legal language, that the allegations were false, that I had documentation of my whereabouts, and that any further harassment calls, texts, police complaints would be grounds for legal action. She also noted that the pattern of contact following my wedding, including the request for money, could be construed as financial intimidation. The calls stopped. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than I'd known before with my family. All my life the silences had felt like punishment, like whether I had to wait out until they decided to let me back in. This silence felt different. It felt like something that was mine. I had made it. I had drawn a line and they had stopped at it, and I was on my side of it, and I was okay. Marcus and I talked a lot during those months. Long conversations at the kitchen table with tea that went cold. Conversations on the couch late at night when neither of us could sleep. He asked me once if I thought I would ever forgive them. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I said I thought forgiveness and contact were two different things, that you could let go of the weight of something without putting yourself back in reach of the hand that threw it at you. He nodded like that made sense. It was one of the things I loved about him, the way he listened until you were actually finished. I started therapy that spring. My therapist had short gray hair and an office that smelled like cedar, and she had a way of asking questions that made you realize you already knew the answer. You'd just been too afraid to say it out loud. In our third session, she asked me what I was most afraid of losing by cutting contact with my family. I said, the idea that they'll eventually come around. She asked me how long I'd been holding on to that idea. I said my whole life. She said, and what has holding on to it cost you? I didn't answer right away, but I thought about it for a long time after. Spring came. My brother got married. I know because Claire, who still had my mother on Facebook, sent me a screenshot of the photos. My mother was in a pale blue dress. My father was standing straight-backed and proud. Derek was smiling the way he always smiles in photos, big and easy, like he has never once questioned whether he deserved to take up space. I looked at the photos for a moment, then I closed them and went about my day. What I did not expect was the call that came 8 days after the wedding. It was from a number I didn't recognize, a North Carolina area code, and something made me answer it. It was a woman who introduced herself as a nurse at a hospital in Greensboro. She said my father had been admitted 2 days prior following a cardiac event. She said he had been asking for me. I sat down. She gave me his room number. She said he was stable. She said the word asking one more time, carefully, and I understood she was not telling me what to do, only telling me what was true. I sat with it for 3 hours. I talked to Marcus. I talked to my therapist by text, which she doesn't usually do, but she made an exception. Marcus said, whatever you decide, I'll drive you. My therapist said, whatever you decide, make sure it's yours. I went. The drive to Greensboro took 1 hour and 40 minutes. Marcus drove. I watched the highway go past and didn't say much, and he didn't push. He pulled into the hospital parking garage and he put the car in park and he said, I'll wait here as long as you need. I squeezed his hand and got out. The hospital was the particular quiet of hospitals, that sound-dampened hush that makes everything feel slightly unreal. I took the elevator to the 4th floor and found the room and stood outside the door for what was probably 2 minutes but felt like much longer. My father was smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing I thought. He was in the bed with monitors attached and an IV in his arm, and he was looking at the window when I came in. But when I closed the door, he turned, and his face did something I had never seen it do in 31 years of being his daughter. He looked relieved. I pulled up the chair and sat down. I didn't say anything. Neither did he, for a moment. Then he said my name. Not in the way he usually said it, which was always with something underneath it: disappointment, or command, or the particular edge of a man who expects you to have already failed him. He just said my name. Quiet. Like it was enough. He said, "I didn't think you'd come." I said I almost didn't. He nodded. He looked at the window again. Outside was the parking structure, and a slice of sky, pale and ordinary. He said, "The wedding. Your wedding." He stopped. I waited. He said, "I've been thinking about it every day. Since then," he said, "I was wrong." 3 words. I had waited 31 years for 3 words. And sitting there in that hospital room with the monitors beeping and the smell of antiseptic and my father looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, I understood something that my therapist had been gently steering me toward for months: that the words, when they came, could not undo what had happened. They could not give me back the father's arm at the top of the aisle. They could not fill the empty pew. They were just words, and they were also the only thing he had left to give me, and they were real. I said, "I know." We talked for almost 2 hours. It was not a movie reconciliation. There were long silences and things that came out wrong, and one moment where I cried, and one moment where he turned his face away so I wouldn't see that he was. He asked about Marcus. He said his name carefully, like he was handling something fragile. I told him about the station, about a rescue we'd run in February that I was proud of, about the apartment and the neighborhood and the life Marcus and I were building. He listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't when I was a child, in a way that made me understand he had been listening to the wrong things his whole life and was only now, here, working out what he had missed. My mother came in near the end. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me and her face crumpled. I stood up and she crossed the room and held me and cried into my shoulder, and I held her back, and I let myself feel the complicated thing that was, which was grief and love and anger all at once, all real, none of them canceling the others out. I didn't stay the night. I said goodbye to my father and told him I would call, and I meant it, with the specific caveat in my own mind that things between us would be different from now on, that I would not rebuild what we had before, because what we had before had been built on something rotten. We would build something new, or we would not, but I would not go back. Marcus was in the parking garage where I'd left him, leaning against the car with his phone in his pocket, not scrolling, just waiting. When he saw my face, he opened his arms and I walked into them. He said, "You okay?" I said, "I don't know. I think so," he said. "Good enough." My father died 14 months later. A second cardiac event, faster this time. I was at the station when I got the call, and I sat in the locker room for a while before I could stand up. Marcus drove to Greensboro with me that evening, and we stayed for 5 days, and I helped my mother with the arrangements, and I delivered a eulogy that was true, not softened, not falsified, but honest about who he was, and who we were to each other, and what the last year had been. Afterward, a woman I didn't recognize came up to me outside the church and said she had worked with my father for 20 years and had never seen him as content as he'd been this past year, and did I know what had changed? I said I thought maybe he had just decided to put something down he'd been carrying too long. She nodded like that made sense. It did make sense. It was the same thing I had done. I still think about the morning of my wedding. I still feel it sometimes, the click of my heels on the marble, the organ, the faces turning. But I think about other mornings too. The morning Marcus and I adopted our dog, a ridiculous hound named Gerald who takes up 3/4 of the bed. The morning I made lieutenant, standing in the station bay with my crew around me, and Marcus in the back, grinning like an idiot. The morning I sat with my father in a hospital room and heard 3 words I thought I would never hear, and chose to stay, not because I owed it to him, but because I had decided that I was the kind of person who could. I didn't get the father I deserved at the beginning of my life. I got something smaller, and harder, and more complicated, delivered late, in a hospital room, with too many silences between us. But I got it, and I chose what to do with it. That choice was mine. No one could take it from me. Not the empty pew, not the police cars on my street, not the $1 bill that started a war that ended in something almost like peace. You get to choose what you carry forward. That's the only thing I know for certain. I chose to carry forward the morning I walked down that aisle alone and arrived, anyway, at the person I was supposed to spend my life with. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.